Now, this is one of those weeks that we're going to move along carefully, deliberately, because there's some pretty vital spiritual principles to be extracted from even the first couple of verses of Deuteronomy chapter 12. Chapters 1 through 11 of Deuteronomy were, in essence, the introduction to what we're going to study in chapter 12. And scholars have established the importance of this section of Scripture by giving it its own name, the Code of Deuteronomy. Now, I think if we can come away with one supreme theme, one overriding God principle from our lesson last week, it is that when the Lord offers us an opportunity to join into His covenant, we do have a choice. It is an offer that we can refuse. The Lord asked Israel, "Do you want to be my people? Do you want me to be your God? If you do, then enter into my covenant with me that I've set before you. If you don't want my covenant, then reject it and walk away." That is the choice set before every man that God approaches. And by the way, there would have been no calamitous penalty per se for Israel to choose to say no to God's offer of covenant. Israel simply would have been denied special holy status and instead would have been rejoined to the universal pool of nations from which they were plucked. From a heavenly and an eternal standpoint, that would have been a grave mistake to refuse the Lord's gracious offer, but from a limited earthly viewpoint, they would have fared no better nor worse than any other nation or people. It is the same for folks today when we're given the opportunity to join Israel's covenant and the Messiah of that covenant, Yeshua, Jesus Christ. By our own free will, we can say yes or no. The yes will forever alter our eternal future and in some ways our earthly experiences. A no will not generally damn us to poverty or to sickness or to some kind of supreme unhappiness during our lifetimes, but no will exclude us from a relationship with the Lord and the primarily spiritual blessings that come from it during both of our natural life and our spiritual eternity. But there is a second part to that covenant pattern, and it is that acceptance of the Lord's covenants brings with it its provisions. And these covenants have terms, they have conditions attached to them. If a man decides not to enter into covenant with God, then the terms of that covenant that he has offered has no bearing on that man, because he's not part of the covenant people. However, if one does decide to accept the offer of a covenant relationship with God, then whoever does so, indeed, has taken on themselves an obligation to obey the terms of that covenant. That's pretty logical, isn't it? And just as that was the case in Moses' era, it remains that way today, and as Christ said, until heaven and earth passes away. It'd be worth our while to take some time this week to set the stage for what we're about to study over the next several weeks, because some ideas and concepts that seem so normal and ordinary and self-evident to us, because it's all we've pretty much ever known, are actually quite revolutionary in their nature. So the impact of those ideas and concepts gets lost. A couple of weeks ago, I used our American Constitution as an illustration of some principles and problems that men face when trying to govern our own earthly societies. So I'll use the Constitution again to make a point, because at least we're somewhat familiar with its structure and its intent. Our Constitution was based on an idea, or better, an ideal, of self-governance and self-responsibility. While the idea of democracy was revolutionary to some degree, various elements of it were previously attempted by ancient Rome. They had a governmental body called the Senate that theoretically represented the people. Other elements of our Constitution were modeled after the famous Magna Carta of the 13th century, which limited the power of the king such that he was supposed to obey the established laws of the kingdom, just like we're ordinary citizens. So our Constitution was really but another, but significant, step towards an ideal of democratic self-rule, not a complete departure from anything that had ever been thought of or attempted. But as radical as our Constitution was seen by many in the year of its establishment, it can't begin to describe the unprecedented detour taken by the covenant of Mount Sinai from all that had been known up to this point in history, particularly as pertains to social justice. Because up to this point, there was only one source of law and justice for any of Earth's societies: the law and the justice is declared by that earthly kingdom's king. The concept first introduced to the Israelites out in the wilderness that a God, instead of a human being, would issue this amazing system of laws and ordinances and rituals by which even the ultimate ruler of the government was to obey, this boggled the ancient mind. And as happens in such cases of radical departure from the norm, it often doesn't even feel real to the people. It seems kind of like a fantasy or something that's far away from their grasp, like a dream or a vision. And it's hard to bring that into practice. It is also rather easy to misinterpret what was meant because there was so little about many of these new concepts that an Israelite could relate to. Often, it was simply easier to mix in a few elements of the law of Moses with ways and customs they'd always practiced, or perhaps to look at what other cultures that surrounded them did and then modify things a little bit. Up to the time of Moses, and it is still largely so within religions of the world except for maybe Judeo-Christianity, people were in a constant search for what the various gods demanded of them. And since they believed that most things that happened to them were the consequences of decisions by some god or another, the people desperately wanted to know which god had intervened in their life, why that god chose to do what he or she did, and was there any way to appease or manipulate that god. But almost universally, it was all for naught, because it was understood that the gods and their desires were generally unknowable. Serendipity ruled. The whims of the gods controlled everyone and everything, and there was little to no logic for what these gods decided, except that, as it was for typical earthly monarchs, they ruled with a self-centered agenda. Now, I'm going to tell you frankly, we have absolutely no way to identify with this ancient mindset unless we've perhaps been deeply involved in a non-Judeo-Christian society. But since most of us have not been raised up in that kind of an environment, let me tell you in a nutshell that life was always uneasy. Because hanging over your head, imagine this now, hanging over your head was knowledge that some god or another could disrupt your existence in an instant. And you might never know why or what you've done to bring that God's wrath upon you. I mean, it was a terrible predicament. I once ran across an ancient poem that dates back to about the time of Abraham, roughly 2000 BC. Segments of this poem have been incorporated into records of several different ancient societies over a period of many centuries. So highly regarded was it that it poignantly expressed the common plight of the human race across all cultural boundaries and eras. I'm going to take up more time than I probably ought to and read a good portion of it to you, because it so soberly captures the dilemma that the whole known world at that time lived in, and much of it still does, because they don't know the one true God. My hope is that two things will be accomplished by our looking at this 4,000-year-old tome. First is that it helps those studying Torah to understand them, the mindset, the psyche of the ancient world that Moses and the Hebrews of the Exodus lived in. A mindset that infected their thinking with such false beliefs. And therefore how difficult it was for these Hebrew refugees from Egypt to grasp, to assimilate that which Jehovah was offering to Israel. And second, so that you can see how incredibly blessed and fortunate we are that God has the character and attributes that he does, and that he has graciously made himself and his laws and his commandments known to us. God possesses a character with attributes that we accept just very matter of fact. We kind of take it for granted. But these attributes were unthinkable, even confusing for the people during the time the Torah was being recorded, because it was such a radical departure from what they or the rest of the world practiced. This 4,000-year-old anonymous poem is called The Prayer to Every God. Let me read it to you. May the fury of my Lord's heart be quieted towards me. May the God who is not known be quieted towards me. May the goddess who is not known be quieted towards me. May the God whom I know or do not know be quieted towards me. May the goddess whom I know or do not know be quieted towards me. May the heart of my God be quieted towards me. May the heart of my goddess be quieted towards me. May my God and goddess be quieted towards me. May the God who has become angry with me be quieted towards me. May the goddess who has become angry with me be quieted towards me. In ignorance I have eaten that forbidden of my God. In ignorance I have set food on that prohibited by my goddess. O Lord, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O my God, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O my goddess, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O God, whom I do know or do not know, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O goddess, whom I do not know or do know, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. The transgressions I have committed, indeed, I don't know. The sin I have done, I do not know. The forbidden thing I have done, the prohibited place on which I've set foot, indeed, I do not know. The anger and the Lord in the anger of his heart looked at me. The God in the rage of his heart confronted me. When the goddess was angry with me, she made me ill. The God whom I know or don't know has oppressed me. The goddess whom I know or don't know has placed suffering on me. Although I'm constantly looking for help, no one takes me by the hand. When I weep, the gods and goddesses don't come to my side. I utter laments, no one hears me. I'm troubled, I'm overwhelmed, I cannot see. O my God, merciful one, I address to you the prayer, ever incline to me. I kiss the feet of my goddess, I crawl before you. How long, my goddess, whom I know or don't know, before your hostile heart will be quieted? Man is dumb, he knows nothing. Mankind, everyone that exists, what does he know? Whether he is committing sin or doing good, he doesn't even know. O my Lord, don't cast your servant down. He is plunged into the waters of a swamp. Take him by the hand. The sin that I have done, turn into goodness. The transgression I have committed, let the wind carry it away. My many misdeeds strip off like a garment. Oh my God, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. Oh my goddess, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. O God, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. O goddess, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions. Remove my transgressions, and I'll sing your praise. May your heart, like the heart of a real mother, be quieted towards me. Like a real mother and a real father, may it be quieted towards me. I won't do any more. But this is really heartbreaking and depressing, isn't it? I mean, this poem expresses the utterly hopeless condition of mankind, the pathetic condition of the world's religious systems, past and present, to do anything positive about it. But it was this condition that the Hebrews, as well as everybody else on planet Earth, were born into. It expresses how all humanity looked at spirituality in general and how their lives were seen as just worthless pawns for these gods and goddesses. Now here along comes this God, this YHWH, and he throws the mother of all curveballs at the world through Moses and Israel. He tells them exactly who he is, precisely what he regards as good and evil. He expects what he expects of every man and woman who loves him. He even commits himself to operate within the bounds of his own unchanging justice system that he's established with Israel. And he says there's no other gods to even consider, and therefore don't bow down to them or fear that which doesn't exist. And that he expects obedience to him to be done out of love and gratitude, not fear and paranoia. Why? Because he first loved mankind even before he created us. He cares about the tiniest element of our lives, and he wants a personal relationship with each of us. The Lord says that these principles he's given to Israel form a foundation for the whole universe. They've always been. They will always be. They and we can count on him staying the same from eternity past to eternity future. Nothing could be further away from the hopelessness of all mankind as expressed in this ancient poem than what the Lord God of Israel offered to his people. How does a society or even one lone individual transition from the kind of desperate thinking that's expressed within this poem and was universally understood to just be the way things are, to comprehending the laws of Moses and the love of God practically overnight? Answer, you don't and you can't. So Israel really didn't get it. It flew in the face of everything they knew. They could hear the words, but it didn't translate to understanding. So they fouled up. They backslid. They repented. They backslid some more. They adopted ways that seemed right to them. And then they committed apostasy. They had a reformation. They fell away again. And this constant cycle that at one moment veered towards God and the next moment moved away from him. Moses witnessed Israel at its best and at its worst over 4 decades. It must have been daunting and frustrating for this anointed leader, but before he died, he spent what I'm sure were several days, if not weeks, expounding in this sermon that we call Deuteronomy on the mountains of Moab about the astounding, if not downright nearly not believable, covenant of relationship that the creator of all things, the king over all kings, lord over all lords, has made with this ragtag group of people who had done nothing to merit it. That's what we're reading in Deuteronomy. And this is the condition of the Hebrew thinking and beliefs that they're trying to overcome. See, we modern believers need to have the greatest empathy and understanding for the Hebrews instead of the contempt that is kind of more typical for what seems like the constant failures and returns to wickedness that we read about in the Bible. We need to understand why the people of Israel didn't, and today's Orthodox Jews don't, view these laws of God as a burden, as do most Christians. Far from it. The law was and remains their greatest joy. Because at last, here is a God who reveals himself, makes clear his character, his demands, his intentions, his rules and regulations. No more wondering about some unknown God that just pops up to interfere in your life. No more despair about the world, what the world of gods might do to you just so they can have a little fun today. Do you want a relationship with God? Well, says Moses, here's who God is. Here's how you have that relationship. It's not going to change, folks. It didn't change yesterday. It won't change today. It won't change tomorrow. And we today are the beneficiaries of all that Israel endured as they attempted to assimilate the awesome, seemingly otherworldly ways of the Lord. Is it any wonder that St. Paul tells Gentiles not to boast because of their newfound relationship with God? A relationship that comes as a result of our Jewish Messiah whose advent came within the context of Hebrew history. And is it any wonder that Paul also tells us that it is our duty and our debt as believers to repay the Jewish people in tangible ways for their delivering us the word, both in stone and in flesh, as it was transmitted to them. I'd like you to keep all this in mind now as we live out our daily existence, and then as we now read Deuteronomy chapter 12 together. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 12. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 211. Here are the laws and rulings you are to observe and to obey in the land that Adonai, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess as long as you live on earth. You must destroy all the places where the nations you are dispossessing served their gods, whether on high mountains, hills, under some leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their standing stones to pieces, burn up their sacred poles completely, and cut down the carved images of their gods. Exterminate their name from that place. But you're not to treat Adonai your God this way. Rather, you are to come to the place where Adonai your God will put his name. He will choose it from all of your tribes. And you will seek out that place which is where he will live, and you'll go there. You will bring there your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tenths that you set aside for Adonai, the offerings that you give, the offerings you have vowed, your voluntary offerings, and the firstborn of your cattle and your sheep. There you will eat in the presence of Adonai your God, and you will rejoice over everything you set out to do, you, your households, in which Adonai your God's blessed you. You will not do things the way we do them here today, where everyone does whatever in his own opinion it seems right, because you haven't yet arrived at the rest and the inheritance which Adonai your God is giving to you. But when you cross the Jordan and you live in the land that Adonai your God is having you inherit, and he gives you rest from all your surrounding enemies so that you're living in safety, then you will bring all that I'm ordering you to the place Adonai your God chooses to have his name live. Your burnt offering, sacrifices, tents, the offering from your hand, all your best possessions that you dedicate to Adonai, and you will rejoice in the presence of Adonai your God. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levites staying with you, inasmuch as he has no share or inheritance with you. Now be careful not to offer your burnt offerings just anywhere you see, but do it at the place that Adonai will choose in one of your tribal territories. There is where you are to offer your burnt offerings, and then do everything I've ordered you to do. However, you may slaughter and eat meat wherever you live and whenever you want, in keeping with the degree to which Adonai your God has blessed you. The unclean and the clean may eat it, as if it were gazelle or deer. But don't eat the blood. Pour it out on the ground like water. You are not to eat on your own property the 10th of your grain, new wine, or olive oil that you set aside for Adonai, or the firstborn of your cattle or your sheep, or any offering you have vowed, or your voluntary offering, the offering from your hand. No, you are to eat these in the presence of Adonai your God in the place Adonai your God will choose. You and your sons, daughters, male and female slaves, and the Levite who is your guest. And you are to rejoice before Adonai your God in everything you undertake to do. As long as you're living on your property, take care not to abandon the Levite. Now, when Adonai your God expands your territories he's promised you, and you say, I want to eat meat, simply because you want to eat meat, then you may eat meat as much as you want. If the place which Adonai your God chooses to place his name is too far away from you, then you are to slaughter animals from your cattle or sheep, which Adonai has given you, and eat on your own property as much as you want. Eat it as you would gazelle or deer. The unclean and clean alike may eat it. Just take care not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life. You're not to eat the life with the meat. Don't eat it. Pour it out on the ground like water. Do not eat it, so that things will go well with you and with your children after you, as you do what Adonai sees as right. Only the things set aside for God which you have, and the vows you have vowed to make, you must take and go to the place which Adonai will choose. There you will offer your burnt offerings, the meat and the blood, on the altar of Adonai your God. The blood of your sacrifices is to be poured out on the altar of Adonai your God, and you will eat the meat. Obey. Pay attention to everything I'm ordering you to do, so that things will go well with you and with your descendants after you forever, as you do what Adonai sees as good and right. When Adonai your God has cut off ahead of you the nations you are entering in order to dispossess, and when you have dispossessed them and are living in their land, be careful, after they have been destroyed ahead of you, not to be trapped into following them, so that you inquire after their gods and ask, how did these nations serve their gods? I want to do the same. You must not do this to Adonai your God, for they have done to their gods all the abominations that Adonai hates. They've even burned up their sons and daughters in the fire for their gods. A major change is about to occur. Israel is no longer going to be a cohesive, although large, group of people who live carefully arranged around a centralized sanctuary known as the Wilderness Tabernacle. A sanctuary that as they relocate, it goes with them. Instead, as they cross now the Jordan River and they take possession of that promised land, they're going to be dispersed according to tribe and clan over several thousand square miles of Canaan. They're going to go into assigned and separate districts. And with this rather drastic change in their daily living condition, The logical and practical question that must be answered for the citizens of Israel is, so, where do we worship and sacrifice? After all, if the requirement remained that only one place is permitted for worship and sacrifice, then by definition that place will be nearby for some tribes, far away and a long journey for most of the others. The subject of the central and single sanctuary is the driving force behind the laws and the precedents that are going to be set down over the next few chapters. And concern over the myriad of false gods and their places of sacrifice scattered around Canaan has something to do with the decisions that resulted in somewhat altered rules and regulations. I also want to point out that another major change is in process. Israel is no longer going to be a Bedouin type of society that just moves around from oasis to oasis in the desert. It's about to become a settled agrarian society, just as the laws of Moses, laws as given through Moses on Mount Sinai anticipated. After all, the 7 biblical feasts are primarily, at least from an earthly point of view, agricultural feasts, which certainly are not central or even possible to observe within a society of wandering herdsmen. We need to take notice of this process because the reality of history is that societies change and evolve with time. I'm old enough, some of you are old enough to have seen it in our own society. We all regularly get together and lament and say, boy, this isn't like it was when we were kids. Very different. The first verse of chapter 12 makes it clear that the rulings that are about to come applies to their taking possession of Canaan. And that rule number 1 is all shrines and altars and temples and places of worship of the Canaanite gods have to be destroyed. Although it zooms by us in only 2 verses, there's a pretty good description of the common characteristics of the places where the Canaanites worship. Verse 2 speaks of high mountains, hills, and under trees. Then verse 3 speaks of the kinds of items that mark those places of worship: altars, standing stones, sacred poles, and carved images of their gods. Now, we've talked about the ancient pagan worship practices before, but since it is brought before us front and center again, let me take just a minute to summarize and review. Whenever possible, an altar of sacrifice was located upon the highest local place, even if it was just a mound of earth, because it was believed that the gods generally preferred to reside on mountaintops. In fact, the mystery of the meaning of one of the earliest biblical titles for God, which is El Shaddai, has only recently been solved. Due to some breakthroughs in deciphering the Akkadian and Ugarit languages, several ancient Hebrew terms are now more clearly defined, because it's long been known that Akkadian and Ugarit were the languages out of which the Hebrew language was born. Shaddai means mountain. El Shaddai means God of the mountain. Naturally, that fits with the mindset of all the world's inhabitants in earliest biblical times. And it also fits perfectly with the incident when God introduces himself to Jacob as El Shaddai. It happens while Jacob is walking through some mountains on his way to Mesopotamia. And he says, hey, I'm El Shaddai, God of the mountain. Now, a high place simply indicated a location that's higher in altitude than what surrounded it. In addition, it could, of course, have a meaning of a place of worship. If a tribe resided on a flat desert plain, A high place for them is just a pile of earth and stones, no more than maybe 3 or 4 feet high. If one was in an area of low rolling hills, then the high place was the highest of the nearby hills. If one was in a more mountainous area, then generally the high place had to be erected on the highest of the nearby peaks. We find the Hebrews engaging in exactly that sort of practice. And the area of Jerusalem, for instance, Mount Moriah is generally the high point of the city. Technically, Mount Olives is outside of Jerusalem. So the temple of God was erected there. But we also see mentioned in verse 2 about altars being erected under trees. It was common among pagan religions to build an altar of sacrifice in a grove of evergreen trees, or they would even plant a grove of trees around an existing altar. The reason was simple. Evergreen trees represented fertility, and sacrifices for fertility were among the most common of all pagan sacrifices. A term we'll occasionally run across in the Bible is Asherah. And an Asherah literally means grove, like an olive grove. Sometimes Asherah is translated as pole, but that's doubtful, except that where it was not possible or practical to have a tree planted, they might have been in a grove of poles, wooden tree trunks that are all dead, of course, that represented trees. Another term we'll run across is Ashtaroth, which is the name of the fertility goddess. So you can kind of see Asherah, Ashtaroth, they're related terms. And around these Asherah, these tree groves, in addition to their altars of sacrifice, they would sometimes place a carved pole. Now, just envision a totem pole. The totem poles we're familiar with are a little bit more elaborate than what was typically carved in the ancient Middle East, but the purpose was essentially the same. They marked that particular place and the altar that was built there as a place to sacrifice to some specific gods and goddesses that were represented in that pole. The standing stones spoken of are sometimes called pillars. But in our modern way of thinking, the word pillar gives us the wrong impression. We kind of think of these tall, cylindrical, decorated stone pillars of a Roman building. That's not what the Bible's talking about. A standing stone was literally a large, flat stone set upright, and at times with wording chiseled into it. But often, as not, the stone just didn't have any markings at all. The stone generally was used in its natural state. A stone cutter didn't shape it. Often it was a monument. It simply said that something important took place at this spot. Other pagan religions saw the symbol of their god in that stone, so it became an object of worship. Now, key to all of this is grasping that anybody can build an altar or a shrine to their god anywhere without divine authorization. The land of Canaan was absolutely peppered with altars and poles and sacred groves dedicated to all the various gods. Single families would build their own private altars. Towns would build communal altars. Kings would erect their own and more elaborate altars. And naturally, these altars would be constructed very nearby for the sake of convenience of the worshiper. The Israelites were fully aware of all this because it was just standard practice. And the reason that God, through Moses, is going through all this detail about altars and shrines is because the Hebrews would naturally have assumed, without giving it a second thought, that they were to do the same thing as everybody else did. They would have built altars and groves to YHWH at multiple locations, nearest to their many settlements. Therefore, in verse 4, Israel is instructed not to worship YHWH in this manner. No groves, trees, totem poles. Rather, says the Lord, there will be a certain place where worship of the Lord is to be located, meaning the place where the tabernacle is to be erected and sacrificing is to happen, and nowhere else. And only this single central place, only there, are the 12 tribes of Israel to journey and to bring their offerings and their tithes and their sacrificial animals. And one of the things that is being legislated against in this instruction was also standard operating procedure for that era. Co-locating a place of worship and sacrifice of one God with the place of worship and sacrifice to another God. An altar was not a place where one could bring a sacrifice and offer to just any god. Every pagan altar and high place was dedicated specifically to a certain named god or goddess. But building an altar was hard work. It was time-consuming. So as people moved in and out of areas and conquerors came and went and brought with them their own set of gods, and as a local god's popularity might rise and fall, usually an existing altar or a high place was just rededicated and converted so it could worship one from this god to this god. YHWH says Israel's not to do that for him. Now, I want to throw out a couple points to ponder, and we're going to wrap things up while connecting all this to God's plan for mankind. Just like in the wilderness tabernacle, there was but one place for all Israel to sacrifice, so it's going to be that way when they arrive in Canaan. But the reason for this isn't given. It could be as simple as God wanting things to operate in the exact opposite way of what the pagan religions did. What we do know for sure is that the central sanctuary, the wilderness tabernacle, got moved on several occasions to different places within Israel, and there did not seem to be any direct objection by God to these moves. Another point concerns this command to topple and destroy all the high places of the Canaanite gods. This command, so completely real and meant to be carried out, has to fall into the same category of being a heavenly ideal. Just as the territorial boundaries that the Lord has laid out to encompass all of his holy land were a heavenly ideal, Israel to this day has never fully possessed all that ideal territory. Never. What's an ideal? It's an expression of perfection. It's the notion of the ultimate state that something can attain. Ideals are, humanly speaking, rarely, if ever, achieved. God's ideals will all be achieved. In reality, Israel never attained the ability to so exercise control over Canaan as to destroy every pagan shrine and altar and Asherah. Even during the powerful reigns of David and Solomon, considered the zenith of Israeli national power, it was never accomplished. Yet we also can conclude that neither of these ideals failed to occur because the Lord was unable, or because the goal was not seriously attainable, but because YHWH made Israel's success in achieving these goals contingent on their obedience to him. We've been reading about that. And as we're going to see in coming chapters and other books of the Old Testament, Israel stumbled greatly in that regard. Therefore, the fulfillment of these ideals that God offered to them have been deferred, and they're not going to be attained until Messiah comes again and rules over all the earth. Now, I point this out because if there is one major reason for us needing a Messiah to carry out God's plan, it is that the fullness of realizing God's ideals could not be brought about while depraved men rule the world. That may sound like just another nice Christian platitude, but the truth is that If mankind could realistically have followed all of God's commandments, then a Messiah wouldn't even be necessary. But with the fall of Adam from his state of being created as the ideal man, a Messiah became the only route to the fulfillment of these heavenly ideals, because mankind now knew evil. And you want to know something? We liked it. But understand, God's commandments didn't fail. God's words didn't fall short. God's creatures fell short. And the creatures I'm speaking about are all humans, not just Israelites. The only creatures with a free will that approximates the free will that the Lord possesses. Further, the covenant of Moses was not faulty. Men were faulty. Therefore, with the advent of Messiah 2,000 years ago, the covenant was renewed, as says Jeremiah 31. But the one who administers the covenant shifts from Moses to Yeshua. Moses was a faulty man. Therefore, he was a faulty mediator. Yeshua was a faultless man. He was the ideal man. Therefore, he's a faultless mediator. Until this ideal man, the Messiah Yeshua, who is also God, returns, and until he rids the world of every human who opposes God, until the evil one who tempts and accuses mankind is locked away, until our King rules in glory and perfection and without tolerance for sin, the ideals of God will never be fully met on earth. But just as when the Lord laid out the Torah for Israel and he told them it wasn't too hard for them, neither is it too hard for us. His believers, at least in the ideal sense, are capable of this. We were created with the ability to physically accomplish these commandments and laws of God. But with the fall into sin of our human father, Adam, it sealed our fate as being a race of failed creatures that would not bring about God's ideals. But Messiah Yeshua can, and he will. And we're going to continue in Deuteronomy 12 next week. Please rise.
Yeshua.